Hello everyone. This week you're going to explore at least one theory that applies to your coursework texts in more detail. I have created two videos, this one on postcolonialism and the other on Marxism, and you can choose which you think is most appropriate for your text choices. Choose really carefully as you're writing an essay based on the theory. You may want to watch both lessons, of course, and then make an informed choice. I would probably encourage you to do that. The only steer I'll give you at this point is that if you've chosen to study The Taming of the Shrew as your second choice, a Marxist analysis is probably more straightforward than a post-colonial one. Parts of the other two texts, lend themselves equally well to Marxist or post-colonial theory. Post-colonial theory is a critical approach that deals with the effects of colonisation on cultures and societies and those societies' responses. If you wrote an explanation of the impact of, for example, the British Empire in India, known as the British Raj, that would be a post-colonial analysis. In literature, post-colonial theory is a little bit more specific. It focuses on the controlling power of representation in colonised societies. In other words, post-colonial writers are interested in how people in power describe and depict the people that they have colonised, taken over. This kind of analysis usually focuses on the negative, disrespectful, damaging effects of that kind of representation. Post-colonial analysis, of course, can be quite straightforward. You could argue that Othello is described by the white Venetians in racial terms that are meant to oppress him, for example when Iago describes him as a Moor. Othello's origins as a man from the colonised north of Africa become a reason to insult and disrespect him. Of course, we've all recently been discussing how racism is often more subtle than the racism Othello endures. The case of George Floyd is a horrifying and extreme effect of a subtler, more widespread, institutional and systemic racism. In the US, the UK and other similar countries, education, the criminal justice system and the economy are in many respects unfairly skewed in favour of white people, while black and minority ethnic communities suffer. This is not just a live political situation that needs our urgent attention. It's also a situation that post-colonial critics and works of literature have examined since at least the 1980s. Remember the poet John Agard from your GCSE studies? In checking out my history, he drew attention to the way that the British education system prioritises white history to the exclusion of black or Caribbean history. This is a post-colonial commentary, as he drew a direct line from the forceful military occupation of the Caribbean by British colonialists to the situation in which students in the UK today learn a very limited amount of black history. If you're going to apply post-colonial theory to the texts that you are reading, you will also want to look out for the other. Iago and the white Venetians describe Othello as if he was completely different or other to themselves, deliberately ignoring, of course, all the ways in which he's actually quite like them as a 16th century military man in Italy. John Agard shows us how those in charge of the curriculum in British schools often treat black history as if it's irrelevant or somehow less British, in other words, other. A text that is crying out for post-colonial analysis is William Blake's The Little Black Boy. This is, of course, not one of the romantic poems that you study, but it was published as part of Blake's Songs of Innocence in 1789. At this time in Britain, slavery was still legal and would not be abolished until 1834. Blake was vehemently against slavery and was probably inspired to write the poem by the foundation in 1787 of the Committee for the Effecting of the Abolition of Slavery. As in many of the poems in the collection Songs of Innocence, Blake was trying to give a voice to the voiceless, a voice to the disenfranchised, those who were oppressed by poverty, disease, gender inequality, or, in this case, race. So the political intentions of the poem are remarkably progressive for the 18th century. Post-colonial analysis of the poem would have to take this into account. A post-colonial critic would, however, also be interested in the way that Blake establishes a duality, an opposition between English whiteness and the boy's African blackness. Take, for example, the first stanza. My mother bore me in the southern wild, and I am black, but oh, my soul is white. White as an angel is the English child, but I am black as if bereaved of light. In this stanza, Blake is introducing the little black boy who was born in the southern wild of Africa. At the very least, the phrase suggests that there is something exotic and exciting about the colonised lands of Africa. Post-colonial critics might focus how, in this way, the colonised land is fetishised, described as attractive or alluring because of its otherness. But the more negative connotations of the word wild also need to be examined in this post-colonial analysis. Is Blake suggesting that the colonised land is full of savages? Is the little boy a savage just because he comes from Africa? We know that Blake loved describing dualities. The collection Songs of Innocence and Experience is full of them. Here he brings up the colour white, associating it with good things like angels and purity, and black, which is often described with bad things like darkness, bereaved of light, for example. And of course, blackness also, when we're thinking about that collection of poetry, reminds us of the chimney sweeps covered in soot. Now, he may have been describing the boy in a sympathetic way to highlight the evils of slavery, but Blake is clearly drawing attention to his racial otherness. These nuances are the kind of thing that you have to examine in more detail when conducting a post-colonial analysis. I would encourage you to read the rest of The Little Black Boy and think about how you would apply post-colonial lenses to the other 6 stanzas. So, in summary, post-colonial analysis is often concerned with issues of race and examines power imbalances in scenarios where one group of people, or a country, has colonised and dominated another. The depiction of otherised groups and individuals often requires closer examination. In The Bloody Chamber, for example, a lot of Carter's characters are described as other because of their inherent natural characteristics. Wolfe Alice may not be described as another race, but isn't Carter using the idea of different species as a way to comment on how we treat people who are different to us? Finally, a description or text doesn't have to be overtly racist for it to be worth applying post-colonial analysis to. Often, colonial narratives are subtler and more insidiously destructive than that, so we need to be extra alert when we respond to them.